Welcome to Lore of the Ring, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. There are places in the world where shadow does not merely fall, it rises. Where darkness is not the absence of light, but a presence unto itself, breathing, watching, waiting. In the first age of Middle-earth, when stars were young and the world still remembered the music of its creation, one such place festered beneath the Iron Mountains. Angband. The name itself is a curse whispered in fear, a fortress of malice carved from living rock, where Morgoth the enemy brooded in his throne of iron and ice. But even Morgoth, mightiest of the Aenir, did not work alone in his designs. In the deepest forges of his dominion, where fire met darkness and thought twisted into nightmare, he wrought weapons of living terror. Balrogs of flame, werewolves of shadow, and from the most terrible fires of all, he conjured something new. Something the world had never seen, something whose very existence would redefine the meaning of dread. The first dragon. His name was Glaurung, father of dragons, the great worm. The deceiver. Golden in his terrible majesty, massive beyond comprehension, a serpent of fire and malice whose eyes held the power to unravel minds, and whose breath could reduce forests to ash. He was not merely a beast, no simple creature of tooth and claw. Glaurung possessed cunning that rivaled the wisest of elves, cruelty that surpassed even the darkness of his master, and a presence so overwhelming that his shadow alone could break the hearts of warriors. In the northern lands, where snow met stone and the wind carried whispers of ancient grief, they spoke his name in hushed tones. Mothers quieted their children with warnings of golden eyes in the dark. Warriors tested their blades and knew them inadequate. The elves, immortal and wise, composed songs of lamentation for wars not yet fought, for losses not yet suffered, because they sensed what was coming. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. The mountains trembled. Not with earthquakes born of natural shifts in stone, but with something far more sinister, the stirring of a will so vast, so hungry, that the very foundations of the world recoiled. In the deep places beneath Angband, where even Morgoth's own servants feared to tread, something moved. Scales scraped against ancient rock. A furnace heart beat its first terrible rhythm. Eyes, golden as cursed treasure and cold as the void between stars, opened for the first time. The age of dragons had begun. But what made Glaurung truly terrible was not his size, though he grew vast as mountains. Not his fire, though it could melt stone. Not even his physical might, though he crushed the greatest fortresses of the elves. No, what made Glaurung the most horrible of all dragons was his mind. A consciousness born of Morgoth's own malice, refined and focused into a singular purpose, the corruption and domination of all free will. He did not simply destroy, he perverted. He did not merely kill, he despaired. In the twilight gloom of Angband's outer halls, where captive elves labored in eternal torment and the air itself seemed poisoned with hopelessness, they felt it first. A new presence, a weight upon their souls unlike anything before. Some claimed to hear words in languages unspoken, promises and threats woven together in a tapestry of dread. Others spoke of dreams invaded by golden light that burned without warmth, that revealed truths better left hidden, that showed futures so bleak the mind recoiled. The first horrible dragon was not yet unleashed upon the world, but already his influence spread like poison through water. Already, the threads of fate were being rewoven around his terrible existence. Heroes yet unborn would have their destinies shaped by this creature. Kingdoms would rise and fall in the shadow of his wings. Love would curdle to despair. Hope would transform to ash. And in the darkest chamber of Angband, Morgoth himself gazed upon his creation and smiled, if such a gesture of twisted satisfaction could be called a smile. For in Glaurung, he had crafted not just a weapon, but a philosophy made flesh. Here was doubt incarnate. Here was the embodiment of inevitability, of doom, of the futility of resistance. Here was the answer to every hope, every dream, every defiant stand against the darkness. The elves would soon learn. The men would soon discover. Even the Valor themselves, in their distant realm across the sea, would come to understand the magnitude of what had been born in fire and shadow. But for now, in this suspended moment between creation and revelation, the world still turned in innocence. Warriors still polished their swords with confidence. Lovers still made promises to the future. Children still laughed beneath stars that seemed eternal. They did not know. They could not know. In the north, in the depths, in the darkness that breathed, a golden eye opened fully. A vast consciousness stirred. A furnace throat drew its first deep breath. And in that breath, the fate of the First Age trembled. To understand Glaurung is to understand the tapestry into which he was woven, the vast, tragic saga of the Elder Days, recorded in fragments and whispers, preserved in the memory of those who cannot forget. These are not tales spun for entertainment around comfortable fires. These are histories written in blood and ash, chronicles carved into the bones of the earth itself, songs that no elf can sing without weeping. The Silmarillion, that great and terrible history, speaks of these times with the weight of unbearable truth. It tells of the trees of Valinor, destroyed by Morgoth's malice, of the theft of the Silmarils, those jewels that held the light of creation itself, of the oath of Feanor, that proud and doomed prince whose words would curse generations, of the return of the Noldor to Middle-earth, an entire people abandoning paradise to wage war against an enemy who had existed before the world began. Into this age of fire and darkness, into this time of impossible heroism and inevitable tragedy, Glaurung emerged. The Silmarillion records his first appearance with characteristic precision. In the winter of that year, Morgoth unloosed upon the highland of Ardgalen a great stream of flame, and in the forefront came Glaurung, father of dragons. Simple words, yet they describe the moment when warfare in Middle-earth changed forever. But the texts give us more than mere chronology. The annals of Beleriand, fragmentary though they are, preserve additional details. Letters between Tolkien and his correspondents reveal deeper layers of meaning. The unfinished tales offer glimpses of stories only partially told. From these sources, we can reconstruct not just what happened, but why it mattered. Glaurung was not the last of the dragons. That horror belonged to Ankalagan the Black, whose size beggared comprehension. Nor was he necessarily the most powerful. That distinction might belong to other later spawn of Morgoth's forges. But Glaurung was the first, and in that primacy lies his unique significance. He was the prototype, the original, the father of a species that would haunt Middle-earth for ages uncounted. Consider the timeline. The Noldor returned to Middle-earth in the year one of the First Age. For over 400 years, they fought Morgoth to a standstill, containing him in Angband, building kingdoms of light and beauty in the very shadow of his fortress. The siege of Angband held, and there was hope, dangerous, fragile hope, that evil might be contained, perhaps even defeated. Then, in the year 455, came the dagger Bragalach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. Morgoth broke the siege with rivers of fire, and at the head of that devastation came Glaurung, barely half-grown, yet already terrible beyond measure. The highlands burned. The siege shattered. The balance of power shifted irrevocably. This was Glaurung's first recorded emergence, but the texts hint at earlier stirrings. References in marginal notes suggest he had been decades, perhaps centuries, in the making. Morgoth had experimented, failed, refined his work. Earlier attempts, failed dragons, as one fragment darkly names them, were destroyed or perhaps still lurked in forgotten corners of Angband. Glaurung represented the perfection of his maker's art, the culmination of thought and power poured into living form. The elves who survived his first appearance recorded their memories in songs of lamentation. They described not just physical destruction, but a more insidious corruption. Wherever Glaurung passed, even the land itself seemed diminished, as though his presence drained not just life, but the possibility of life. Grass did not merely burn, it forgot how to grow. Water did not merely evaporate, it lost the memory of flowing. Stone did not merely melt, it surrendered its will to endure. Scholars debate the nature of Glaurung's creation. Was he bred from some lesser creature, elevated and twisted by Morgoth's power? Was he wrought entirely from darkness and fire, a being of pure malice given form? The texts offer no clear answer, and perhaps that ambiguity itself is significant. Glaurung's origins remain shrouded in mystery, as if even the world itself preferred not to remember how such horror came to be. What we know with certainty is his impact. After Glaurung's first emergence, the character of the war changed. No longer was this merely a conflict of armies and sieges. Now it became a war of morale, of spirit, of the very will to resist. For how could mortal flesh stand against a creature that seemed to embody inevitability itself? How could hope survive in the shadow of wings that blotted out the sun? The chroniclers tell us that some among the elves and men began to despair, not from cowardice, but from a terrible clarity of vision. They looked upon Glaurung and saw not just a monster, but a message from Morgoth. This is what I can create. This is merely the beginning. Your courage means nothing. Your sacrifice changes nothing. Despair and surrender. Yet they did not surrender. Not then. Not yet. But the question lingers across the centuries, echoing down through the pages of forgotten manuscripts and half-remembered songs. If Glaurung is the first, what other horrors are yet to come from the darkness he embodies? What worse nightmares still sleep in the forges of Angband, waiting for the moment when despair becomes total and resistance finally breaks? The chronicles preserve the question, but offer no comfort in answer. To speak of Glaurung's form is to grapple with inadequacy of language. Words strain and break beneath the weight of describing something so fundamentally wrong, so antithetical to the natural order, that even memory recoils from its clarity. Imagine, if you dare, a serpent vast as a river, its body spanning the distance between hills, its bulk crushing ancient stones to powder with casual movements. His scales were not merely golden. They held the hue of cursed treasure, of wealth that corrupts, of light that burns rather than illuminates. Each scale was larger than a warrior's shield, overlapping in patterns of geometric perfection that somehow suggested wrongness, as if the very mathematics of his being violated natural law. His head alone was the size of a great hall, jaws capable of swallowing horses whole, teeth like swords of bone that could rend steel as easily as flesh. But it was his eyes that truly broke the spirit. Golden, yes, but not with the warmth of sunlight or the gentle glow of candlelight. This was the gold of fever, of madness, of hypnotic compulsion. To meet Glaurung's gaze was to feel your thoughts unraveling, your will dissolving, your very identity beginning to fragment. The elves, who had gazed upon the face of the valor and stood unbowed, found themselves frozen beneath that terrible stare. Men, brave beyond reckoning in ordinary battle, discovered reserves of courage they did not know they possessed, and watched in horror as even those reserves proved insufficient. For Glaurung did not merely inspire fear, he commanded it. His presence was a weight upon the soul, a pressure that built and built until something had to break. Resolve, sanity, hope itself. His breath was fire, but not the clean flame of hearth or forge. This was corruption made combustible, malice given heat and form. Where Glaurung's fire touched, it did not simply burn, it befouled. Trees did not merely become ash, they twisted in their dying, their wood splitting in patterns that suggested agony. Stone subjected to his flame did not crack naturally, but shattered into fragments whose edges seemed designed to wound. Even the air itself, superheated by his passage, became difficult to breathe, as if his presence poisoned the very atmosphere. Yet for all his terrible physicality, Glaurung's true horror lay in his mind. Morgoth had crafted in him an intelligence that rivaled, perhaps exceeded, the wisest counselors of the elves. He possessed cunning that could unravel centuries-old strategies, patience that could outlast the resolve of immortals, and an understanding of fear and desire so profound that he could manipulate the strongest wills. Consider his encounter with Turin Tirrambar, that most doomed of heroes, at the sack of Nargothrond. Turin came in fury, sword raised, courage burning in his heart, ready to strike down the dragon regardless of cost. And Glaurung, who could have incinerated him with a breath, who could have crushed him beneath one coil of his vast body, instead chose a more terrible weapon: words. With deliberate cruelty, the dragon spoke. His voice was not the roar one might expect from such a creature, but something far worse. A sound that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the mind. Deep and ancient and utterly devoid of mercy, it wove truth and lies together so skillfully that the listener could not distinguish one from the other. To Turin, he spoke of forgotten duties and abandoned loved ones. He reminded the hero of his mother and sister, left behind and unprotected while Turin pursued glory and vengeance. He twisted the knife of guilt until Turin, mighty in battle and unbreakable in combat, crumpled beneath the weight of his own conscience. The dragon did not need to kill him. He murdered Turin's purpose, his certainty, his very reason for standing there with sword raised. This was Glaurung's true genius, the understanding that the most devastating wounds are self-inflicted. He did not destroy his enemies so much as he convinced them to destroy themselves. His hypnotic gaze did not simply paralyze, it revealed. It showed his victims truths they had hidden from themselves, dragged forth secrets they had buried, illuminated failures they had tried to forget. And in that pitiless revelation, in that moment of absolute clarity about one's own inadequacy, the victims will shattered. The texts preserve accounts from survivors, few though they were, of Glaurung's presence. They speak of heat so intense it was felt not on the skin but in the bones, of a smell like sulfur and burning metal in something else, something organic and wrong that could not be named. Of the sound of his movement, scales scraping stone with a whisper like 1,000 knives being sharpened, the rustle of his vast body moving through space too small to contain it, the crack of trees shattering, and the groan of earth compressing beneath his weight. But more than these physical details, they speak of the psychological assault. The sense that one's thoughts were being observed, catalogued, found wanting. The growing certainty that resistance was futile, that courage was delusion, that hope itself was nothing more than a lie told by the desperate. This was the environment of Glaurung's presence, a zone where even the strongest minds began to fracture. His lair in Nargothrond, after he claimed that once beautiful realm, became a place of special horror. The dragon did not simply occupy the space, he transformed it. The beautiful halls carved by elven craftsmanship became extensions of his will. The treasures hoarded there, and dragons hoard not from avarice, but from an instinct to corrupt, to remove beauty from the world and lock it in darkness, became cursed by association. Even light behaved strangely in his presence, as if photons themselves recoiled from illuminating such wrongness. Guards stationed at the borders of his territory reported nightmares even while waking. Dreams of golden eyes and whispered promises of power, of glory, of escape from duty's burden. Some deserted. Some went mad. Some walked willingly into the dragon's domain, compelled by a call they could neither explain nor resist. And through it all, Glaurung lay in the darkness, his vast intelligence working. Planning, waiting, understanding that time itself was a weapon when one's lifespan stretched toward immortality, and one's enemies grew old and tired and began to doubt. The dragon could afford patience. His enemies could afford only increasingly desperate courage. In the scorched valleys where his shadow fell, nothing grew. In the rivers he crossed, fish died for miles downstream. In the very air above places he had been, birds refused to fly. The first horrible dragon was a hole in the world, a space where creation itself seemed to curl away in revulsion. And he knew it, and he reveled in it. The forests bent beneath winds that carried his scent, and in those contorted trees, those twisted branches reaching in directions that defied natural growth, one could read the story of his passage like words written in wood and ruin. He was coming. He was always coming. And no courage, no matter how bright, could truly banish the knowledge of what approached. The deeds of Glaurung are inscribed in the annals of the First Age not as mere historical events, but as wounds upon time itself, moments when the world was diminished, when the light grew a little dimmer, when hope became that much harder to sustain. The dagger Bragalatch, the battle of sudden flame, stands as his first great atrocity. In the year 455 of the First Age, after centuries of relative stability, Morgoth struck. Rivers of fire poured from Angband, consuming the highlands of Ardgalen and transforming that green land into a desert of ash forever after known as Anfaglith, the gasping dust. And at the vanguard of that destruction came Glaurung, still young, still growing, yet already devastating beyond measure. The siege lines of the Noldor, maintained for 400 years, shattered in a single night. Entire companies of elven warriors, veterans of countless battles, stood their ground and were incinerated where they stood, not because they lacked courage, but because courage means nothing to fire that burns hot enough to melt stone. Their weapons failed them. Their armor became their pyres. Their names are remembered in songs so sorrowful that even hardened warriors weep to hear them. But physical destruction was only the beginning. Glaurung did not rampage mindlessly. He advanced with terrible purpose, targeting not just military positions, but symbols of hope. He made for the Tower of Minas Tirith, not the later city of Gondor, but the original watchtower guarding the northern pass. There, Orodreth held the fortress, and their Glaurung demonstrated that walls meant nothing, that all the craft of elvish engineering could not stand against living malice. He did not breach the walls. He did not need to. He coiled at the base of the tower and looked up, and in that gaze, the defenders felt their certainty crumbling. Day after day, the dragon waited, his presence alone a siege weapon more effective than any catapult or battering ram. Men and elves on the walls began to see things in the patterns of his scales. Dreams invaded waking hours. Whispers echoed in empty corridors. Finally, Orodreth abandoned the tower, not in defeat by arms, but in defeat of spirit. The elves marched out with weapons intact, banners still flying, bodies unharmed. But their eyes were hollow. Their songs were silent. They had stood in the shadow of Glaurung and understood with a clarity that broke them the futility of resistance. This became the dragon's pattern. He conquered as much through presence as through violence, though when violence was needed, he supplied it in horrifying abundance. The years passed, measured in increments of loss. Glaurung grew. His scales hardened until even the mightiest arrows shattered against them like twigs. His fire intensified until he could reduce forests to cinders with a single breath. His cunning deepened as he learned the weaknesses of each enemy. The pride of the Noldor, the fear of mortal men, the desperation of those fighting a war they increasingly understood they could not win. Then came the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, the battle of unnumbered tears in the year 472. The forces of elves and men assembled in their greatest alliance, the last desperate throw of the dice, the final chance to break Morgoth's power. The armies were vast, the heroes legendary. Fingon led the Noldor. Men of the three houses marched beneath their banners. Even dwarves came from their mountain halls, setting aside ancient grudges. For a moment, impossibly, they seemed to prevail. The forces of Morgoth gave ground. The gates of Angband appeared within reach. Victory, that phantom that had haunted their dreams for centuries, seemed almost tangible. Then Morgoth revealed his reserve. Glaurung emerged, fully grown now, accompanied by lesser dragons and fire drakes bred in his image. The field of battle became an inferno. The alliance shattered. Heroes whose names had been synonymous with hope fell screaming or stood frozen in hypnotic thrall. The unnumbered tears began, and they would flow for days. But Glaurung's supreme atrocity, the deed that would echo through ages and become the centerpiece of the most tragic songs ever composed, was the sack of Nargothrond. This hidden city of the elves, carved into the banks of the river Narog, had remained secret and safe through centuries of war. Its king, Orodreth, the same who had abandoned Minas Tirith, had learned caution. Nargothrond did not march to open war. It remained hidden, a beacon of preserved beauty in a world of increasing darkness. But secrecy cannot protect against treachery. The location of Nargothrond was revealed, and Glaurung came in his full terrible majesty. The bridge before the gates became a killing ground. The river boiled from the heat of his breath. The great doors, wrought with skill and sealed with ancient craft, melted like wax. Inside, the slaughter was methodical. Glaurung did not simply kill, he desecrated. The halls filled with smoke and the screams of the dying. Treasures accumulated over centuries became part of his hoard, not from greed, but from a desire to remove beauty from the world. The survivors were driven forth into slavery or left broken in spirit, alive only to spread tales of the dragon's invincibility. And it was here, at the bridge of Nargothrond, that Tir Rambar made his stand. This hero, marked by doom from birth, raised his black sword Gurthang and prepared to challenge the dragon. Here was courage incarnate, defiance in its purest form, a mortal man standing against a force that had broken armies. Glaurung could have killed him, should have killed him, but the dragon recognized in Tir something more useful than another corpse, an opportunity for exquisite cruelty. Instead of fire, Glaurung used words. Instead of physical death, he delivered psychological devastation. He spoke of Tir's mother Morwen and sister Niner, abandoned and unprotected. He twisted guilt until it became a weapon sharper than any sword. And Tir, mighty Tir, unbreakable in battle, crumpled. He lowered his sword. He turned away from the dragon, away from the burning city, away from his purpose. He went seeking his family, walking directly into a web of fate so terrible that even the Valor might have wept to witness it. This was Glaurung's masterpiece, the destruction not of a city, but of a hero, not of a body, but of a purpose. Nargothrond fell in fire and blood, yes, but Tir fell in a way far more complete. The elves composed songs about that day. They sang of the river running red, of the smoke that blotted out the sun, of the screams that echoed from the hills. But they also sang of something quieter and more terrible. The sight of a hero walking away, shoulders bent, sword trailing in the dust, defeated by words rather than wounds. In the ruins of Nargothrond, Glaurung coiled atop his hoard and considered what he had accomplished. Cities could be rebuilt. Armies could be reformed. But a broken hero, that wound would fester across generations. That poison would spread through every tale told about this age. The dragon did not smile, for his face was incapable of human expression. But if malice could be said to feel satisfaction, then in that moment, Glaurung knew something approaching joy. The songs remember. The blood has long since washed away, but the songs remember. And in their remembering, the horror lives on, eternally fresh, eternally terrible. There are weapons that cut flesh, and then there are weapons that cut thought. Glaurung wielded both, but it was the latter that made him truly horrible, truly the first among dragons in infamy. For what is the breaking of a body compared to the corruption of a soul? The elves, in their complex language, had multiple words for what Glaurung could do. There was glam, the enchantment of direct magical compulsion. There was ghoul, the corruption through sorcery. But for what the dragon did, they coined a new term, glaur, which meant something like golden doom or bright poisoning. The idea that what appears beautiful or luminous might be the very source of destruction. His eyes were the focal point of this power. When Glaurung fixed his gaze upon a victim, something happened that defied simple description. The survivor accounts, and there were tragically few, speak of a sensation like falling while standing still, of thoughts that suddenly felt foreign, of memories that twisted and reformed into new, terrible shapes. Imagine knowing your own mind, trusting your own memories, being certain of your purpose and history. Now imagine all of that becoming uncertain. Did that event happen the way you remember, or is the dragon's whispered version correct? Did you come here for the reasons you thought, or were you always serving a different master? Is your courage real, or merely a form of pride that the dragon is helping you see clearly? This was not simple lies. Lies can be detected, resisted, overcome by truth. What Glaurung offered was something far more insidious, plausible reinterpretation. He took the truth and rotated it, showing it from an angle that revealed hidden darkness. He found the seeds of doubt that exist in every thinking mind and watered them until they bloomed into forests of uncertainty. The tale of Turin and Niner stands as the ultimate example of this power's cruelty. Turin, having fled from Nargothrond under the dragon's manipulation, eventually returned seeking to avenge the fallen city. He came upon Glaurung at the ravine of Cabdenaras, and there, with desperate courage, he climbed beneath the dragon and drove his sword Gurthang into Glaurung's soft underbelly. The dragon was wounded mortally. The hero had triumphed. This should have been the moment of victory, of vindication, of hope restored. But Glaurung, even dying, had one more poison to deliver. Turin's sister Niner had been held in the dragon's thrall, her memory stolen, her identity erased. Glaurung had kept her in a state of enforced amnesia, a living weapon of fate waiting to be deployed. Now, as Turin stood over the dying dragon, Niner approached. With his last breath, Glaurung released her from the spell, but not mercifully. He restored her memory with perfect, calculated cruelty. She remembered who she was. She remembered who Turin was. And she understood, in one terrible instant of clarity, that she had married her brother unknowingly, that she carried his child, that every moment of happiness in her recent life was built on a foundation of unknowing incest and doom. The dragon died, but his victory was complete. Niner cast herself into the ravine. Turin, learning the truth, fell upon his own sword. Two more victims claimed not by fire or fang, but by knowledge, truth weaponized, reality made unbearable. This was the enchantment of minds at its most refined. The understanding that sometimes the cruelest thing you can do is allow someone to see clearly. But Glaurung's mental dominion extended beyond individual victims. There are accounts, fragmentary, often dismissed as myth, but persistent, of entire regions falling under a kind of atmospheric despair. Villages at the edge of the dragon's hunting territory reported mass nightmares, collective visions of golden eyes and whispered surrender. Crops would still grow, buildings would still stand, but the people became hollow, going through the motions of life without hope or joy. Some scholars suggest that Glaurung's presence created a kind of psychic pressure, a field of influence that affected not just those who met his gaze, but anyone within a certain radius. The closer one came to the dragon, the more this pressure intensified, until even the strongest wills began to fracture. Distance provided some protection, but even miles away, people reported feeling watched, judged, found wanting by something vast and terrible. The elves, with their deep understanding of mental states and their ability to perceive things hidden from mortal senses, were paradoxically more vulnerable to this attack. Their very sensitivity, their capacity for profound thought and feeling, became a liability. Where a simple man might feel only terror, an elf experienced the full existential weight of the dragon's message. That beauty was temporary, that their long struggle was ultimately futile, that even immortality was no shield against despair. There are records of elves who never saw Glaurung, never came within leagues of him, but who nonetheless fell into a melancholy from which they never recovered. They would sit in their beautiful halls, surrounded by art and music, and find no joy in it. When asked what troubled them, they could not say, only that something had gone out of the world, some essential light had dimmed, and they could not remember how to hope. This was contagion of the soul. Glaurung did not need to personally break every spirit. He merely needed to break enough, and the despair would spread on its own, each victim inadvertently infecting others with their hopelessness. The dragon understood this. His intelligence was not merely tactical but strategic, operating on timescales that span generations. He knew that the most enduring victories were not won on battlefields but in hearts and minds. Destroy a city, and it might be rebuilt. Destroy the will to rebuild, and the desolation becomes permanent. Consider his hoarding behavior. Dragons are famous for collecting treasure, but with Glaurung, this was not simple avarice. Each beautiful thing he locked away in darkness was a tiny murder of hope. Every elven heirloom, every crafted masterwork, every symbol of cultural achievement that he added to his hoard was one less light in the world. He was creating an inventory of loss, a catalog of everything beautiful that could no longer be seen, could no longer inspire, could no longer remind people what they were fighting for. And he wanted people to know this. He wanted the elves to understand that their greatest works now served only to cushion his sleep, that their most precious memories were now his playthings, that all their striving had resulted only in treasures for his collection. The psychological warfare was exquisite in its cruelty. Every hero who fell to Glaurung's enchantment became a story, and every story became a weapon against the next hero. How could you stand against a foe who had broken Turin the Mighty? How could you trust your own mind when the dragon could make you forget yourself, betray yourself, destroy yourself? The answer, of course, was that you couldn't, not with certainty. You could only stand anyway, knowing that your thoughts might betray you, that your courage might be illusion, that even victory might somehow become defeat in the dragon's golden gaze. And in that standing anyway, that defiance in the face of not just death, but the possibility of being made complicit in your own destruction, there perhaps lay the only true resistance to Glaurung's enchantment. But it was a resistance that few could maintain. The mind is not built to sustain constant doubt about itself. Eventually, something breaks. Eventually, the whispers become too loud. Eventually, the golden eyes find the weakness they seek. Somewhere in forgotten caverns, perhaps the question still echoes. If your own mind cannot be trusted, if your own memories can be rewritten, if your very sense of self is mutable in the presence of sufficient power, then what are you, really? Glaurung knew the answer, and the knowing was his greatest weapon. Even dragons, it seems, are subject to fate. Even malice incarnate must eventually face the one appointment that cannot be avoided, the one enemy that cannot be enchanted or burned, the ending written into the very fabric of their story. The year was 499 of the First Age. Glaurung had reigned in terror for decades, his name a byword for despair, his deeds a catalogue of atrocities. Nargothrond lay in ruins behind him, its treasures claimed, its people scattered or enslaved. The dragon had achieved everything Morgoth might have desired: the breaking of hope, the corruption of heroes, the transformation of beautiful lands into wastelands of ash and sorrow. But Turin Tir-Rambar still lived, and in him burned a rage that even Glaurung's enchantments could not fully quench. This was the hero the dragon had broken at Nargothrond, the man whose purpose he had shattered with words. Yet purpose, once lost, can sometimes be reforged in the fires of vengeance. Turin had learned of the dragon's location at Cab Danaras, the ravine where a tributary stream carved deep into the earth. The hero came in darkness, moving with the stealth of desperation. He brought with him Gurthang, the black sword, a weapon of power forged from a shard of meteoritic iron, a blade that had its own dark sentience and had drunk the blood of friend and foe alike. If anything in Middle-earth could pierce Glaurung's scales, it was this sword. But Turin knew he could not face the dragon directly. To meet those golden eyes again was to invite the same paralysis, the same corruption of will. Instead, he conceived a plan born of both cunning and suicidal courage. He would attack from below, from the one angle where even the father of dragons was vulnerable. The ravine of Cabdenaras was narrow and deep, its walls steep and slick with spray from the rushing water below. Turin positioned himself on one side, concealed among the rocks, and waited. The waiting itself was a torture, hours of anticipation, knowing that at any moment the dragon might sense him, might turn those terrible eyes upon his hiding place, might speak words that would unravel his resolve before he could strike. The earth trembled first. Then came the sound, the massive scraping of scales against stone, the hiss of breath that could melt rock, the sense of a vast intelligence approaching. Glaurung came to the ravine, intending to cross, his enormous bulk filling the space between walls. And Turin struck. He emerged from concealment and climbed, impossibly, up the dragon's very body, using the gaps between scales as handholds, pulling himself up the living mountain of malice and fire. It should have been suicide. Glaurung should have crushed him, burned him, swept him away like an insect. But perhaps the dragon's arrogance, that supreme confidence born of decades of unchallenged dominance, created a moment's hesitation. Perhaps fate itself, that force which even Morgoth could not entirely control, demanded this conclusion. Perhaps Turin's rage burned so hot that even Glaurung's fire seemed cold by comparison. The hero climbed to the dragon's underbelly, that one place where scales did not fully protect, and there he drove Gurthang upward with all his strength, with all his fury, with all the accumulated grief of a life defined by loss and doom. The sword pierced. Black blood, hot as magma, poured from the wound. Glaurung screamed, not with the voice of a beast, but with a sound that seemed to tear the fabric of reality itself. A cry of pain and rage, and perhaps disbelief that this could be happening, that he, the first and terrible, could be brought low. The dragon thrashed, his massive body convulsing, smashing against the walls of the ravine. Turin barely escaped, pulling himself away and scrambling to safety as tons of writhing serpent churned the earth and stone. The water below boiled from the heat of spilled blood. The air filled with the stench of burning and something else, something that might have been the scent of Morgoth's work undone, of malice made mortal, of terrible life leaving terrible flesh. Glaurung dragged himself from the ravine, mortally wounded but not yet dead. He collapsed on the far bank, his golden scales now dulled with dust and blood, his eyes still burning but with a different light, pain instead of power, mortality instead of malice. And it was then, in his dying moments, that the dragon delivered his final poison. Turin, believing the dragon dead, approached to claim his victory. But Glaurung still had strength for words, still had power enough for one last act of cruelty. Nina, Turin's sister, had been held in the dragon's enchantment, her memories stolen, her very identity erased. Now, as Turin stood in triumph, Glaurung released her, but not kindly. He restored her memory with perfect timing and perfect cruelty, ensuring that she would understand exactly what had happened, what she had done in her state of enforced amnesia, what future now awaited her. The dragon's last words were not of pain or rage, but of satisfaction. Even dying, even defeated, he could claim victory through the poison of truth, through the weapon of revelation wielded with malice aforethought. Then he died. The great golden body stiffened. The furnace heart, which had beat with dark purpose for decades, fell still. The eyes, which had broken so many wills, glazed over and saw nothing. The first dragon, the father of worms, the great deceiver, was gone, but his victory was complete. For what followed was tragedy of such magnitude that it overshadowed even his death. Niner, understanding what she had done, what she had become, cast herself into the ravine. Tjurin, learning the truth from witnesses, fell upon his own sword. The hero who had slain Glaurung did not survive his victory even a full day. The battlefield fell silent. No armies clashed. No trumpets sounded. Just the quiet sound of water flowing over rocks, the whisper of wind through a devastated landscape, and the massive corpse of the dragon slowly cooling. Word spread, as word does. Runners carried the news to whatever kingdoms and settlements still endured. The dragon Glaurung was dead. The first horrible was gone. This should have been cause for celebration, for hope renewed, for the sense that perhaps Morgoth's creatures could be defeated after all. But the tidings brought no joy. How could they when the cost was so evident? Tjurin and Niner both dead. Nargothrond destroyed. Countless lives shattered. The victory was so Pyrrhic it barely deserved the name. Elves came to look upon the corpse. They studied the massive form with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that this particular nightmare had ended. Horror at contemplating what it had cost to end it. Some proposed that the body be burned, that no trace of Glaurung should remain. Others suggested it be left as a monument, a reminder of what evil could achieve and what price might be necessary to overcome it. In the end, nature made the decision. The body rotted where it lay, bones slowly scattering, scales dulling and cracking, until eventually the place where Glaurung fell became just another location in a landscape defined by tragedy. But the memory did not rot. The songs did not fade. The lessons, bitter though they were, persisted. The first horrible dragon had fallen. The father of worms was no more. But the echoes of his deeds, the ripples of his malice, continued to spread through the waters of time. Heroes yet unborn would hear the tale of Tjurin and Glaurung and understand that sometimes victory and defeat are too intertwined to separate. In the silent ravine, water continued to flow. The stone bore scars from the dragon's thrashing, marks that would persist for ages. And if you listened carefully, though no one did, for who would linger in such a place? You might almost hear the ghost of a whisper, the memory of words spoken with dying breath, the final curse of a malice that refused to die cleanly. The dragon was gone, but the dragon's work endured. Death is not always ending, especially for those whose deeds reshape the world. Glaurung died in 499 of the First Age, but his influence did not die with him. Like a stone cast into still water, his existence created ripples that spread outward through time, touching ages and peoples far removed from the battle at Cab Danaras. The most immediate legacy was biological. Glaurung was the first, but he would not be the last. From Morgoth's forges came others of his kind. Ankalagan the Black, mightiest of all, whose wings could blot out the sun. The countless fire drakes and cold drakes who would plague Middle-earth for millennia. And eventually, in a later age, Smaug the Golden, who would destroy Erebor and terrorize the north. Each of these dragons carried something of Glaurung in them. Not merely physical characteristics. The serpentine form, the terrible intelligence, the fire that burned hot enough to melt stone, but something deeper. A philosophy, perhaps, an approach to evil that emphasized not just destruction but corruption, not just killing but breaking. The dragons that followed Glaurung learned from his example. They hoarded not from simple greed, but as a means of removing beauty from the world. They spoke when they chose to speak, with words designed to wound the spirit rather than merely convey information. They understood that the most enduring victories were psychological, that a broken will was more useful than a broken body. Even Smaug, millennia later in the Third Age, displayed tactics that echoed Glaurung's methods. When the dragon of Erebor conversed with Bilbo Baggins, he did not simply threaten. He sowed doubt. He played upon fears. He attempted to corrupt through insinuation and partial truth. The lineage was clear, but the legacy extended beyond mere biological descendants. The tale of Glaurung and Turin became archetypal, a story that resonated through the ages. It was sung in the halls of elves, told in the mead halls of men, recorded in the lore books of scholars. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: the courage of Turin, the tragedy of Niner, the malice of the dragon, the futility of struggling against fate. In the Second Age, when Númenor rose to greatness and then fell to corruption, some historians saw echoes of Glaurung's influence in the island kingdom's doom. The temptation to power, the corruption of wisdom into pride, the way that truth could be twisted until it became poison. These were all lessons learned from the dragon, even if the people of Númenor never consciously made the connection. The rings of power themselves, forged in the Second Age, bore a philosophical kinship to Glaurung's methods. Like the dragon's enchantment, the rings offered power while simultaneously enslaving. Like his hypnotic gaze, they revealed truths while corrupting the will. Sauron, who crafted the scheme of the rings, had been a servant of Morgoth. Had he perhaps observed Glaurung's techniques and adapted them to his own purposes? In the Third Age, the memory of the First Age dragons had faded to legend for most peoples. But among the elves, who forget nothing, the tale of Glaurung remained vivid. When Smaug attacked Erebor, there were elves in Rivendell and Lothlorien who remembered, personally remembered, with the eidetic clarity of immortal memory, the terror of the father of dragons. To them, Smaug was not unprecedented but echoing, a reminder that some evils recur, that some nightmares never truly end. The very landscape bore Glaurung's mark. Anfaglith, the gasping dust, remained a desert where once had been green highlands. The ruins of Nargothrond, even thousands of years later, retained an aura of desolation. Travelers who passed through these places reported unease, nightmares, the sense of being watched by malevolent eyes. Whether this was actual residual power or simply the weight of historical knowledge is debatable, but the effect was real. In the libraries of Gondor, scholars preserved accounts of the First Age, including detailed descriptions of Glaurung. These texts were studied not just as history, but as tactical manuals. If dragons could return, if such evil could manifest again, how would one fight it? The death of Glaurung provided a template. Attack from unexpected angles, exploit the rare vulnerabilities, strike with weapons of power, and above all, do not meet the dragon's gaze, do not listen to the dragon's words. But beyond tactics and biology and history, Glaurung's deepest legacy was philosophical. He represented the idea that evil could be intelligent, sophisticated, even in some terrible way beautiful. The golden scales, the hypnotic eyes, the eloquent malice, these challenged simple narratives of good versus evil. Glaurung was not a mindless monster. He was a thinking, planning, understanding being who chose evil with full awareness of what he was doing. This was, in some ways, more disturbing than simple brutality. It suggested that evil was not merely ignorance or madness that might be cured, but a genuine alternative philosophy that intelligent beings might consciously embrace. The dragon did not serve Morgoth because he was enslaved or deceived. He served because their purposes aligned, because he found fulfillment in corruption and dominion. Theologians and philosophers in later ages wrestled with the implications. If a being as intelligent as Glaurung could be irredeemably evil, what did that say about the nature of choice, of redemption, of the possibility of change? The dragon became a test case for theories of morality and free will. Artists, too, found in Glaurung an enduring subject. Tapestries depicted his battle with Turin. Songs recounted his deeds. Paintings attempted to capture the terrible beauty of his form. Even in the Fourth Age, long after dragons had passed from the world, the image of Glaurung endured as a symbol of temptation, of corrupted majesty, of intelligence in service of malice. There were even dark cults in hidden places that venerated the memory of the dragon, not as a god, but as an exemplar of a different philosophy, a path of power through domination and the transcendence of conventional morality. These groups were small and quickly suppressed, but their existence itself testified to Glaurung's enduring influence. In dreams, too, the dragon lived on. There are accounts, scattered through the ages, of individuals who claim to have seen golden eyes in their sleep, to have heard whispers in voices too deep for human throats, to have felt the presence of something vast and terrible observing them. Most dismissed these as nightmares or delusions, but some scholars wondered, could the psychic imprint of a being as powerful as Glaurung somehow persist beyond death? Could his will, his malice, leave echoes in the collective unconscious of Middle-earth? The question remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. What is certain is that Glaurung's influence extended far beyond his lifetime. In every dragon that followed, in every tyrant who ruled through fear and manipulation, in every instance of beauty corrupted and wisdom twisted into cruelty, something of the first horrible dragon could be seen. Myths have power not because they are true or false, but because they are meaningful. They shape how we understand the world, how we interpret events, how we conceive of possibilities. Glaurung became a myth, not in the sense of fiction, but in the sense of a story so significant that it transcends its historical origins and becomes part of the permanent furniture of thought. Even now, even in ages far removed from the First Age, even in times when dragons are extinct and Morgoth is cast into the void, the name Glaurung resonates. It carries weight. It evokes images and emotions. It reminds us that evil can be beautiful, that intelligence is no guarantee of virtue, that sometimes the most terrible defeats look like victories. The first horrible dragon died millennia ago, but in a very real sense, he never died at all. He persists in memory, in story, in the patterns we recognize when encountering malice dressed in golden scales. And in the deepest caves, the forgotten places where no light has shone for ages uncounted, some claim you can still find dragon bones, massive beyond comprehension, slowly turning to stone. Whether any of these belong to Glaurung himself is unknown. But those who have seen them report a strange sensation, the feeling that the bones are watching, that intelligence lingers in calcified marrow. that death itself has not entirely claimed the father of dragons. Perhaps it is imagination. Perhaps it is merely the weight of history making itself felt. Or perhaps some evils are too vast to die completely, and their echoes will whisper through the ages until time itself comes to an end. In the aftermath of great evil, there are always the survivors. Not the celebrated heroes whose names echo through history, but the ordinary individuals whose lives were shattered, whose losses cannot be sung because they are too numerous, too commonplace, too much like the grief we all might feel. Glaurung's victims are counted in the thousands, but we know few of their names. The warriors who stood on the walls of Minas Tirith as the dragon approached, who felt their courage crumble beneath his gaze, who abandoned their posts not from cowardice, but from a despair so profound it obliterated all other emotions. Who remembers them? They returned to their homes broken, unable to explain what had happened, unable to make their families understand that they had encountered something that unmade the very concept of resistance. The elves of Nargothrond who were not present for the final sack, who returned to find their beautiful city transformed into a tomb and treasure house, who searched through scorched halls calling names that would never be answered. Their songs of lament are too painful to be widely sung. They exist in archives, performed only on certain sorrowful anniversaries, because even immortal hearts can bear only so much renewed grief. The children orphaned by Glaurung's raids, who grew up with the knowledge that their parents had fallen to a horror beyond comprehension. Some became heroes themselves, driven by vengeance. Most simply became survivors, carrying wounds that never fully healed, flinching at unexpected sounds, unable to enjoy peace even when peace returned. And Tir-Rambar himself, is he hero or victim? His courage was unquestionable. His strength of arm legendary. He slew the dragon, accomplished what armies could not. Yet his life was a cascade of tragedies, each seeming to flow inevitably from the last, until even his greatest triumph became merely another step toward doom. His story is preserved in the Narn Ihin Hurin, the Lay of the Children of Hurin, one of the great tragic tales of the Elder Days. It is not a story that ends happily. There is no redemption, no last-minute salvation, no sense that suffering was ultimately worthwhile. There is only the relentless grinding of fate, the sense that some lives are marked for sorrow from their beginning, and that courage and virtue are no protection against doom. Morwen, Tir-Rin's mother, spent years waiting for news of her children, protecting her daughter as best she could, enduring hardship and loss with a strength that might have rivaled any warrior's. When she finally learned the truth of what had become of her family, the incest, the deaths, the fulfillment of every curse ever laid upon them, she went to the grave of her children and died there, of a broken heart. There is no glory in such an ending, only the quiet extinction of hope. Nina herself, who suffered perhaps most of all, robbed of her memory, stripped of her identity, made to live a life that was a lie, and then forced to confront the truth at the worst possible moment. What justice is there in her story? What meaning can be extracted from such cruelty? The answer, perhaps, is that there is no meaning. Not all stories have morals. Not all suffering teaches lessons. Sometimes evil simply wins, and the only response available is lament. The Elvish poems speak of this. They do not try to find silver linings or hidden purposes. They simply mourn. They name the lost. They describe the beauty that was destroyed. They sit with grief rather than trying to transcend it or explain it away. There is a particular lament, rarely performed, that lists the names of those who fell at Nargothrond. It takes hours to sing in full. The melody is simple, almost monotonous, because the point is not artistic beauty but memorial. Each name is given its moment, its acknowledgement. This person existed. This person mattered. This person is gone because of Glaurung, and their absence diminishes the world. Modern listeners sometimes find such laments unbearable. The relentless accumulation of loss, the lack of narrative resolution, the refusal to find meaning in suffering. These violate our expectations of how stories should work. We want to believe that heroism matters, that sacrifice accomplishes something, that even in tragedy there is purpose. But the lament refuses this comfort. It insists that sometimes people die for nothing, that sometimes evil triumphs, that sometimes the dragon wins even when the dragon dies. This, too, is part of Glaurung's legacy. He forced an encounter with meaninglessness, with the possibility that courage and virtue are not enough, that the universe does not necessarily bend toward justice. Those who survived him had to live with this knowledge, had to find ways to continue hoping and striving even while understanding that hope and striving might prove futile. Some could not bear it. There are records of survivors who simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped participating in life. They sat in silence, waiting for death, because continuing required a strength they no longer possessed. Others transformed their grief into something harder. They became grim, relentless, stripped of joy, but also of doubt. If the dragon could destroy beauty, they would destroy the dragon and everything like him, regardless of cost. They lived for vengeance, and when vengeance was accomplished, they did not know what to do with themselves. And a few, precious few, somehow found a way to carry their grief without being destroyed by it. They mourned, but they also continued to love, to create, to believe that beauty was worth preserving even if it could not be protected forever. These were perhaps the true heroes, the ones whose strength lay not in slaying dragons, but in refusing to let dragons define the terms of existence. But even for them, the lament was necessary. The acknowledgement that yes, this happened, yes, it was terrible, yes, the losses are real and permanent and worthy of sorrow. Without the lament, the grief goes underground, becomes toxic, corrodes from within. So the songs persist, the names are spoken, the stories are told even when they hurt to tell, because forgetting would be a second death, a second victory for Glaurung. The dragon destroyed bodies and cities, but he would not be allowed to destroy memory. In the quiet moments, in the still places, the lament continues. For Tyr-Rin, for Niner, for Morwen, for the thousands whose names we do not know. For the forgotten heroes who stood against the darkness and fell, whose courage was real even if it was not sufficient. The dragon is gone, but those he destroyed deserve to be remembered, not as casualties or statistics, but as individuals, each loss a wound in the fabric of the world that never fully heals. This is the lament of forgotten heroes. Not that they were forgotten, but that they should not be, must not be, will not be, as long as anyone remains who understands what was lost when they fell. There is a pattern in the histories of Middle-earth, a recurring motif that the wise have noted across ages. The great evils do not truly die. They transform, persist, echo. Morgoth was cast into the void, but his influence shaped the entire First Age and beyond. Sauron was defeated, but the corruption he sowed lingered for generations. And Glaurung, the first horrible dragon, though his body rotted in the ravine of Cabdanaras, left shadows that have never fully dispersed. To understand Glaurung's ultimate significance, we must step back from the immediate drama of his deeds and view him from a cosmic perspective, as one thread in a vast and terrible tapestry. The Ainulindale, the music of the Aenir that shaped creation itself, contained from its beginning the discord of Melkor, who would become Morgoth. Evil was woven into the fabric of reality from the moment of creation, not as an accident, but as a necessary element of a world where free will existed. Glaurung was an expression of this primordial evil, but filtered through intelligence and given specific form. He represented not chaos, but ordered malice, not destruction for its own sake, but corruption with purpose. In this, he was more terrible than a natural disaster or mindless monster. He was evil that thought, that planned, that understood exactly what it was doing and chose to do it anyway. The philosophers of Gondor, in their analyses of the First Age, debated what Glaurung truly represented. Some argued he was simply a weapon, a tool wielded by Morgoth. Others contended that he possessed genuine autonomy, that his evil was his own choice rather than imposed programming. The question matters because it touches on fundamental issues of responsibility and the nature of evil itself. If Glaurung was merely Morgoth's puppet, then the horror is somewhat diminished. He becomes tragic in his own way, a being created without choice in his nature. But if he chose his path, if his intelligence was genuine and his malice authentic, then he becomes something more disturbing, proof that sentience and wisdom are no guarantee of virtue, that beings can understand goodness and consciously reject it. The texts suggest the latter. Glaurung's conversations with Turin show not programmed responses, but genuine thought, creativity and cruelty, an understanding of psychology and morality sophisticated enough to manipulate them. The dragon knew what he was destroying. He comprehended the value of what he corrupted, and he did it anyway, because doing so fulfilled him in ways that virtue never could. This is the deep horror, not that evil exists, but that it can be consciously chosen by beings capable of understanding the alternative. Yet there is another layer to consider. Fate, or as the elves called it, the doom that was laid upon certain individuals and families. Turin was cursed from birth, marked by Morgoth's malice against his father Hurin. Every choice he made, every attempt to escape or defy his destiny, seemed only to drive him more certainly toward the tragic end. Was Turin's encounter with Glaurung inevitable? Was the dragon merely an instrument of a fate that had already been written? The question is unanswerable, and perhaps that is intentional. The legendarium of Middle-earth does not offer comfortable certainties about predestination versus free will. It presents both as somehow true simultaneously. Choices matter and shape outcomes, yet patterns recur, dooms are laid, fates are fulfilled. Glaurung operated in this ambiguous space, both choosing his actions and fulfilling a role that seemed scripted by forces beyond him. This ambiguity itself is meaningful. It reflects the lived experience of existence, where we make choices yet live within constraints, where we shape our destinies yet are shaped by forces beyond our control. Glaurung's story does not resolve these tensions but embodies them. As we stand here, millennia removed from the dragon's death, what lessons persist? What warnings does his story offer? First, that intelligence is not virtue. The wise can be wicked. The knowledgeable can be cruel. Education and enlightenment do not automatically produce ethical behavior. Second, that beauty can mask horror. Glaurung's golden scales were magnificent, his form in some terrible way majestic. Evil often comes wrapped in attractive packaging, offering power, glory, the fulfillment of desires. The surface gleam distracts from the corruption beneath. Third, that psychological wounds can be more devastating than physical ones. Glaurung's greatest victories came through words, through the manipulation of truth, through the breaking of wills. In our own lives, we face similar attacks, not from dragons, but from ideologies, manipulations, the subtle corruptions that erode integrity from within. Fourth, that some victories are indistinguishable from defeats. Turin slew Glaurung, accomplished what armies could not, yet the result was tragedy complete. Sometimes succeeding in our immediate goals leads to larger failures. The narrow focus on one objective can blind us to the greater patterns of consequence. And finally, that memory matters. The lament matters. The preservation of these stories, however painful, serves a purpose. By remembering Glaurung, by refusing to forget his victims, by maintaining the chronicle of what happened and what it cost, we resist a final victory of oblivion. The dragon wanted more than destruction. He wanted erasure of beauty, of hope, of memory itself. Every treasure he hoarded was an attempt to remove it from the world's memory. Every hero he broke was an assault on the very concept of heroism. His ultimate goal was not just to defeat his enemies, but to make them forget why they had ever resisted. By remembering, we deny him this. By telling the stories, by singing the laments, by preserving the chronicles, we insist that what was lost mattered, that those who fell had value, that the struggle was meaningful even when it failed. In the deepest sense, this is our defiance against all the Glaurungs of history. Not that we win. Victory is never guaranteed, but that we remember. We bear witness. We testify to what was and what should have been and what was lost in the gap between. The loom of fate continues its work, weaving patterns we can only partially discern. New threads are added daily. New stories begin, flow, conclude. And somewhere in that vast tapestry, the shadow of Glaurung remains visible, a dark golden thread that speaks of the time when the first dragon walked the earth and the meaning of terror was redefined. He was the first horrible. Others followed, each terrible in their own ways, each adding their own shadows to the pattern. But Glaurung remains unique, the prototype, the original, the one who showed what dragons could be and what they could do to those who opposed them. In certain light, if you look at history from the right angle, you can still see his influence. In the fear that grips hearts at the prospect of speaking truth to power. In the despair that whispers resistance is futile. In the temptation to preserve ourselves by surrendering our principles. These are the echoes of Glaurung's philosophy, still rippling through time. But there are other echoes too. The courage to stand even when victory seems impossible. The refusal to let fear dictate choices. The commitment to preserve beauty even knowing it cannot last forever. These are the echoes of those who opposed the dragon, who fell but did not surrender, who lost but did not yield the field of meaning and memory. The battle continues long after the dragon's death. Not with swords and fire, but in the realm of ideas, values, the fundamental choice between hope and despair. And so we return to where we began, to the shadows beneath the iron mountains, to the moment when something terrible first stirred in darkness and opened eyes that had never before seen the world. We trace the arc from that beginning through centuries of terror to the death in the ravine and beyond, into legend and memory and the perpetual present of story. Glaurung the Golden, father of dragons, the great worm, the deceiver, the first horrible. He came into the world in fire and malice. He departed it in pain and final cruelty. And in the space between, he shaped the age, broke heroes, destroyed kingdoms, and demonstrated that evil could be both beautiful and intelligent, both purposeful and terrible. The dragon is gone. The age is gone. The world that knew his shadow has passed into memory. But in the deep places, in the forgotten corners, in the caverns where no light shines and time moves strangely, there, some say, you can still hear it. The scrape of scales on stone. The deep breath of furnace lungs. The whisper of words that corrode the will and break the heart. Perhaps it is only echoes. Perhaps it is merely the wind, finding strange voices in the spaces between rocks. Or perhaps some evils are too vast to ever truly die. Perhaps they wait, patient and timeless, knowing that the patterns they began will recur, that the shadows they cast will find new forms, that the lessons they taught will need to be relearned by each generation. The loom of fate continues its work. The shadows remain woven in the pattern. And somewhere in the darkness, golden eyes that have not existed for millennia still watch, still wait, still whisper their terrible truths to those foolish enough to listen. This is the legacy of Glaurung, the first horrible dragon. Not merely what he did, but what he revealed about the nature of evil, the fragility of good, and the eternal struggle between the two. His story ends. But the questions he raised endure, echoing across ages, waiting for answers we may never possess. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.